John Deering, who grew up in Chicago, Illinois, described his childhood as tumultuous. Due to neglect, he was placed in a reformatory from the ages of 13 to 18. Despite aspiring to join the military from a young age, Deering ended up joining the United States Merchant Marine. However, he soon found himself incarcerated at both San Quentin State Prison and Folsom State Prison in California. Around 9 p.m. on May 9, 1938, 52-year-old real estate businessman Oliver R. Meredith Jr. was found shot and bleeding to death in his car in Salt Lake City. Meredith was taken to the nearby Madsen Apartments, where he lived with his wife, but he died shortly afterwards. A .38 caliber shell casing was found at the scene, and bullets retrieved from Meredith's body matched those from a carjacking on May 7th involving Maurice L. Howe and his wife, Lucille. The couple from Ogden identified Deering as the assailant who had robbed them of $11 that night in Salt Lake City. Investigators discovered a .38 Colt automatic pistol sold for $3 around May 12th to a pawnbroker near the Palace Casino in Reno, Nevada. This firearm was traced to Deering and matched the bullets from the crime scene through ballistic fingerprinting. On July 29, 1938, Deering was arrested in Hamtramck, Michigan, on suspicion of robbing the Hamtramck Finance Company. Having already spent 17 years in prison, Deering was determined to avoid another 15-year sentence in Michigan. Despondent over his mother's death and hoping for execution, Deering confessed to kidnapping the Howes and killing Meredith in Salt Lake City. He admitted to fleeing the scene after the shooting and learned about Meredith's death from a newspaper the following day. Deering also claimed to have killed another man on a freight train and disposed of his body in a swamp, although this victim remained unidentified. Investigators later linked Deering to the shooting of 2 police officers in Salt Lake City and another in Portland, Oregon. He was also implicated in the murder of George L. Olson in Twin Falls, Idaho, and the torture killing of Hazel and Nancy Fromm in Van Horn, Texas, though no evidence connected him to those cases. Deering was charged with Meredith's murder on August 1st and extradited to Utah on August 6th. Just before being placed on the train back to Salt Lake City, Deering remarked, "I don't mind dying. I see the futility of it all." Deering opposed the appointment of a defense attorney during his arraignment before Judge Herbert M. Schiller on August 11, 1938. His murder trial began on September 19th at the 3rd District Court, initially with attorney Edgar C. Jensen representing him. Deering expressed regret for shooting and killing Meredith to steal his car, requesting to be executed without all the red tape and rigmarole of courts. The trial featured an outburst from Deering when the court entered a mandatory plea of not guilty on his behalf. At one point, Deering had to be restrained with handcuffs after violently protesting the need to call Meredith's elderly widow as a witness, despite his confession. Judge Schiller noted Deering's most extraordinary attitude in refusing counsel and seeking his constitutional right to plead guilty to face the death penalty. The jury delivered a guilty verdict on September 21st after just an hour of deliberation, to which Deering responded, "You've done your duty." The court subsequently appointed public defender Clifford L. Ashton to represent Deering, who requested execution by firing squad over hanging at his sentencing hearing on September 24th. With no request for retrial or commutation of the sentence pursued, his execution date was set just 3 months after his arrest. Deering's sister, Dorothy Devaney, wrote to him urging him to fight the case, but he did not heed her plea. While awaiting his death sentence, Deering aimed to be a model inmate and became popular with the prison guards. On the night of October 30th, 1938, Deering ate his last meal of pheasant, a dish he had never tasted before. He was accompanied by his young attorney, prison warden Owen Nebecker, and chaplain Jim B. Morton. During the meal, Deering remarked, "From here on, I've got to be an actor. Nobody must know what goes on inside of me." He agreed to let physicians monitor his heart activity during his execution, which was believed to be the first such experiment conducted. At 6:30 a.m. on October 31st, Deering was taken to a room at Sugar House Prison in Salt Lake City. 75 witnesses were present, while blankets covered the windows to block the view of hundreds of curious onlookers outside. A guard placed a target over Deering's heart and a hood over his head. Prison doctor Stephen H. Beasley attached sensors to Deering's wrist to monitor his heart with an electrocardiogram, which showed his heart rate increasing from 72 beats per minute to over 180 when he was strapped to a chair before the firing squad. Sheriff S. Grant Young selected the 5 marksmen, each paid $50 by the county. Their identities were kept secret. One rifle was loaded with real bullets, and the rest had blank cartridges, so no one would know who fired the lethal shot. After thanking the warden for treating him well, Deering's last words were, "Goodbye and good luck. Okay, let it go." 22 seconds later, at 6:46 a.m., Deering was shot. His heart entered into a spasm for 4 seconds and gradually stopped after 15.6 seconds. He continued to breathe and struggle in his chair for nearly a minute. Deering was pronounced dead at 6:48 a.m., 134.4 seconds after his heart had stopped. He was 40 years old. Jason Fairbanks lived with his family on East Street in Dedham and was courting 18-year-old Elizabeth Fales, who was 2 years younger than him. Both came from old, respected Dedham families, and they met while attending a singing school at the First Church and Parish in Dedham. Their relationship was described as desultory and somewhat ambiguous, marked by the disapproval of Fales' parents, Fairbanks' poor health, and Fales frequently breaking up with and then reconciling with Fairbanks. Fairbanks confided in a friend that he planned to meet Betsy in order to have the matter settled, stating he either intended to violate her chastity or take her to Wrentham to be married, as he felt he had waited long enough. On May 18, 1801, Fales met Fairbanks in a birch grove next to Mason's pasture, about 400 yards from her home, and told him she could not marry him. Fales was subsequently stabbed 11 times, including once in the back, and her throat was slashed. Fairbanks, covered in blood, staggered to her home and told her family that she had committed suicide. He also claimed to have attempted to take his own life, but failed, accounting for his wounds, which left him still alive but in a most deplorable situation. Fales' family found her writhing in her own blood, her body cruelly mangled. She was conscious and took a small sip of water, but died soon after in her mother's arms. Herman Mann, the editor of the local paper, was called to the scene and reported the incident in the next edition of his weekly newspaper under the headline, "Melancholy Catastrophe." Fairbanks, too injured to be moved, recuperated at the Fales' home and did not attend Fales' funeral, which was attended by 2,000 people, likely the largest crowd ever assembled in Dedham at the time. He was eventually moved by letter to the Norfolk County Jail, where he remained until the grand jury indicted him on August 4, 1801. Fairbanks was arraigned on August 5th, and the trial began the next day. Due to the immense interest in the case, involving 2 prominent families, the trial was initially moved from the new courthouse to the First Parish Meeting House across the street. When that venue also proved too small, the trial was moved to the town common. The prosecution was led by Attorney General James Sullivan. Over 30 witnesses testified, stating that they had heard Fairbanks make threats against Fales and her parents. Sullivan presented evidence suggesting Fales could not have inflicted all her own wounds and demonstrated that Fairbanks had borrowed the murder weapon from a field hand that morning. Fairbanks' family physician, Dr. Kitteridge, testified about Fales' wounds, but was later indicted for perjury. Fairbanks' defense team consisted of Harrison Gray Otis and John Lowell. They focused on sentimental issues, aiming to create reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds. They argued that Fairbanks, who had lost the use of his right arm due to a smallpox vaccination and was generally sickly, could not have committed the crime. They suggested, though Fairbanks later strongly denied it, that the lovers had a murder-suicide pact. The defense also attempted to discredit the government witnesses and claimed that Fales had become unbalanced after reading too many romantic novels. The trial concluded on the evening of August 7th. The next day, August 8th, the jury found Fairbanks guilty, and he was sentenced to death. On the night of August 17th, Fairbanks escaped from jail along with several others. A $1,000 bounty was offered for his capture. The murder, trial, and escape triggered a media firestorm. One newspaper implored readers to stop the murderer. Fairbanks was captured in Skenesboro, New York, while waiting for a steamer to take him to Canada. He was eating breakfast when he was discovered by Seth Wheelock, Captain Henry Tisdale, and Moses Holt. Surprised to have been pursued so far, Fairbanks said he would have ridden another 400 miles had he known. Instead of being returned to Dedham, where he had previously escaped, he was taken to the Suffolk County Jail in Boston. On September 10, 1801, Fairbanks was brought back to Dedham from the Boston jail and was hanged. For many years following the tragedy, little was published in newspapers about the murder. It wasn't until 15 years later that an account of a murder committed by Mr. J.Y. upon his family in December of 1781 appeared in print. The authenticity of this account is often questioned due to the detailed information and the suspicious time frame of its release. The complete story was published in 2 parts in the New York Weekly Magazine, with the first part appearing on July 20th, 1796, and the second part appearing on July 27th, 1796. The account was written to the editor by someone named Anna, who claimed to have received the information from a woman who knew James Yates. Before providing a very detailed first-person narrative of the murders, the woman noted that while James Yates was not particularly wealthy, his family was well respected. According to this account, on the night of the murders, the Yates family hosted a few community members for a religious gathering. Yates' sister stayed later than most of the other guests. Yates behaved as he usually did, displaying particular affection towards his wife. She had expressed a desire to visit New Hampshire, and he had planned to take her there the next morning. After his sister left, Yates and his wife continued reading the Bible together. His wife held their infant, their oldest child sat nearby, and their 2 other children were already asleep. Yates claimed to have seen a light, followed by a spirit that instructed him to rid himself of his idols. He began his rampage by throwing the Bible into the fire. Then, grabbing his axe, he went outside and destroyed the family sleigh before turning his axe on the family's animals. According to the account, Yates heard the voice again, saying, "You have more idols, look at your wife and children." He then went to his children's room and, following the voice's instructions, threw his 2 sons against the wall and fireplace, killing them. Realizing that his wife and remaining child had fled, he grabbed the axe and pursued them outdoors. He saw his wife running towards her parents' house, and managed to strike her with the axe, causing her to drop their baby. Yates then ended the baby's life by throwing her against a fence. His wife was injured, and seeing her in agony momentarily brought Yates to his senses. He began to lovingly embrace her, but the voice haunted him once more. He grabbed a stake from a fence and repeatedly struck his wife, then placed the dead infant on top of her. Shortly after, Yates found his last child hiding in the barn. He brought her over to where her mother and sister lay, and instructed her to dance around the bodies as he debated killing her. Eventually, he struck her in the forehead with the axe. After ridding himself of the last of his idols, Yates reflected on his actions and realized that he would likely face severe consequences, such as prison or even death. He considered placing the bodies in the house, setting it on fire, and blaming the incident on Indians, but decided against lying, believing he had a good motive for his actions. Early the next morning, Yates appeared at his sister's house, and she noticed the blood on his hands. In a crazed state, he attempted to grab a knife, but she managed to resist him, tied him down, and ran to inform the neighbors. Yates was then taken to Tom Hannock. At Tom Hannock, a religious man referred to as Mr. W. tried to counsel Yates, but he refused to confess his error. Yates next stayed with a woman named Mrs. B., to whom he disclosed the events of that night, still believing that the directions from the spirit were meant to be followed. Yates was eventually imprisoned in Albany, where he is said to have escaped twice, disappearing into history. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button to join our community. We upload every Monday and Thursday at 4 p.m. For more content like this, be sure to check out our other videos on the channel. You can also follow us on our other social media platforms for uploads and updates. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.